if you've had an abusive physical or whatever upbringing, you have my utmost sympathy up to the point that you start doing that to your family. That's that point where you can break that cycle. As horrifically hard as it may be, you know it was awful. So for you to then repeat that action, then you have to accept that that's the point where you've made an informed decision.
So, doing this for the second time, because last time
went a bit sideways.
Oh well. Tell me about yourself. How did your story start?
What, my career story or my life story?
Let's start overall with a little bit of a background.
I was born in Woolwich in southeast London in 1965, and I was brought up in what was then a village called Welling, which was in Kent. One of the most notable people from Kent, or from Welling in Kent, was Kate Bush. She grew up there. It's now part of London. It's been subsumed by London. So we stayed in London until I was about 7 or 8, and then we moved to a town about 80 miles west called Swindon. My mother had a job there. Swindon was built as an overspill town for London. A lot of people London was getting too crowded at the time, so they built these new towns. One of them was Swindon, and we moved there, and I stayed there for on and off about 24 years, on and off. Went to school there. Met my friends who are still friends today. One of them is my bandmate, because obviously, as you know about the band. And then when I was 18, I got a job with a company called Thailand. The job was, my friend who is the bandmate, his father worked for one of these government-backed vocational centres, and he got me the interview for this apprenticeship, and I went along there, very stylish. I was wearing a burgundy suit with a grey leather strip tie, very, very trendy at the time. And the guy who owned the company asked me what I knew about electronics, and I said absolutely nothing, but I'm willing to learn. And for some reason, I think it must have been my stylish suit, he decided to give me an opportunity, and I then served my apprenticeship there. The company manufactured a thing called mass flow controllers. That was their principal item that they produced, and it was used in the manufacturing of semiconductors, silicon chips. And it was a way of being able to control gases very precisely by mass rather than volume. Okay. So I worked there. He put me through my 9th class where I got my degree. It took me 5 years to get my degree. Normally it's 3 years for full time, but because I was part time, and I worked my way up from being the trainee to being the senior field service engineer. And that's what took me to America, to where the head office was in Torrance in Los Angeles. And I went over there and I worked for the research and development department. Part of my role was to develop a device which could measure. The way that a silicon chip works is basically it's an inert substrate which then built up alternating layers of resistive and conductive layers on top. Depending on how thick that layer is, depending on what material is used to create that layer, the way they do it is they put these things into these what they call diffusion furnace systems. So there's these tubes which heat up to a certain temperature. A gas is introduced which will either produce a conductive or a resistive effect, and depending on how long it's there for, it will then build up a layer on the surface of this. So we're talking about things which are angstroms thick, so thousandths of a millimeter, and 10,000ths of a millimeter. And it was then for me to be able to create a device which could say how thick these layers were. And so I became the laser specialist for the department because we were using lasers to measure. And the way we would do that is I'm going to take you back to your physics days now. You have reflection and you have refraction.
All right.
Now, reflection is obviously where there's an equal and opposite reflection from a piece of light which is striking a reflective surface, but refraction is where the beam of light, which does have dimension, will strike it at an angle and it will slow one side of it down slightly before another. So basically, if this was a beam of light and it comes down, the part that hits it first will be slowed down because it can't pass through that medium quite as quickly, and that will then refract. That's why when you look into a swimming pool, your legs appear to be somewhere else because the light is effectively being bent. So my job was to be able to devise a way to be able to determine by various means what the surfaces were. We used a thing called the Fresnel equation to do that. So I then became a laser specialist. During the course of time that I was doing this, the organisation also had military contacts, and we had people from Marconi and McDonnell Douglas come in, and they were at the time working on weapon systems for the United States Air Force. So they wanted me to subcontract to the 412th Test Wing in Edwards Air Force Base, which I did. So I subcontracted out. I became what's called an NMPO, which is a non-military pilot officer, as a weapons engineer, a WISO, weapons systems officer. So my role there was a non-military weapons systems officer, and I worked on the Apache, the AH-64 Apache program to be able to produce some of the weapons guidance systems, the graphical targeting systems, the countermeasures, the glitter ball on top of the rotors, and that sort of thing. So I worked there.
And what age was this? What age were you at the time?
Early 20s.
Oh wow.
So yeah.
You must have been stoked.
It was a surreal existence. I mean, the thing is, you've got no point of reference really, because this is what your life is, isn't it? My life at that time was, I all my life, everything that's happened to me, the only skill set I've brought to the table with this is having the common sense to recognise an opportunity when it's in front of me. Because when I went for that interview, I was bringing nothing to the table. It was, nobody in life is ever successful without somebody taking a chance on them. Nobody's ever successful without somebody giving them that opportunity. I don't care how much somebody fights, I don't care how much somebody works, sooner or later somebody must give them that opportunity. And that's got to be recognised and appreciated. I brought very little to the table. All of the heavy lifting in my life has been done through blind luck. So yeah, I was over there working on that. Then after a few years, there was a bit of a global recession. The company I worked for had to do some downscaling, and one of the departments they were going to get rid of was the research and development department. So I was made redundant. I was offered a job to remain in Los Angeles, but I didn't want to. And the reason I didn't want to was because at that time I was in a relationship with a girl which was kind of all heading towards marriage, an American girl. She worked for the company as well. And I kind of didn't really want to marry her, but I also didn't have the courage to tell her I didn't want to marry her. And so I thought the best opportunity was just to leave. So that's what I did. I then had I had
the same reaction last time you said it.
Yeah.
It was very interesting. That probably wasn't easy for you.
No, I mean, it wasn't easy. I was an you say these things happen. I wasn't a mature 20-something-year-old. Parts of my life I was quite mature and quite methodical in. But other parts of my life I was just a typical young idiot. And she was older than I was. She was about 6 years older than I was, so she was kind of heading towards 30, and I think that she saw this as being like, the marriage and children and stuff like that, and I was like, no, I'm not ready for this yet. I was still a kid myself, so to my eternal shame I just sort of like used it as an excuse, and then the relationship kind of just petered out after that, which it wasn't anything to do with her, it was all to do with me. I was just, I wasn't a particularly mature or pleasant man when it came to relationships at that point in my life. It took a while before I kind of got into my stride a little bit about not being an asshole when it came to women, but there we are. So yeah, I then had a brief stint as a photocopier engineer in between jobs because I took the redundancy. I didn't really know what I wanted. Well, I did know what I wanted to do, but it wasn't an opportunity. And then I joined the police. And the reason I joined the force I did was because I'd had laser surgery on my eyes some years before to correct short-sightedness, and I applied to my local force. I lived in Swindon at the time, so the local force was Wiltshire. And they said, we won't take you because you had this laser surgery on your eye, so we don't know what the long-term effects of it's going to be. So this is before law changed. You can't do that now. You can't ask medical questions before you offer somebody the job anymore. But they did at the time, and they said, I don't think any force will take you. So I then ran around the 43 forces in England and Wales, and the nearest one to me that was recruiting at the time was Gwent, which was in Wales, so just across, it was 2 counties over. There was Wiltshire, then there was Avon, Somerset, then there was Gwent. And I went along for the interview, got the job, funnily enough. And that was then my career for the next 3 decades. And this obviously is where I met my wife. And so that's kind of my potted history. And now I'm a retired man of leisure.
Let's go in a little bit of detail regarding, I want to take it bit by bit. I found it particularly interesting when you said that you ended up at some point going into the Middle East with your job working on weapon systems for the Apache and so on and so forth.
Yeah, we went to when they did the first Desert Storm.
So this is 1991.
Yeah. We were in Al Juf, which was and I didn't deploy with the 412. The 412 test wing was a purely research and development based. Most of the stuff they did was with propulsion systems, but they had this sort of sub thing at the time where they did these other little bits and pieces, and this is at the time when they were working on weapon systems. So I deployed with the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, to go there. And it was really just because the weapon systems were so new, didn't really know how they were going to react in combat situations, and also in hostile environments. I don't mean militarily. I mean, the fact there's a lot of dust and a lot of sun and heat and big temperature differences between day and night. We've done a lot of stuff, but you've got to have this beta testing. So they wanted the engineers over there to be on hand. So obviously I wasn't in any combat situations, but I was over there as an engineer to be involved in the assessment of how the aircraft systems were working, just niff-naff stuff really. So that was an interesting period of time. The first time I went over there, and then I went back again later in the year. But the first time I went over there, it was all tense and being billeted with everybody, because I had notional officer status, but because of the fact it was so early on in the conflict. The Americans are fantastic at logistics. A British infantryman will carry enough on his back to be able to survive basically unsupported for about 8 days with the food and whatnot. The Americans, day and a half. So their logistics is enormous within the military. That the Chinooks and everything like that. Their logistical core is just beyond. When I went back the next time, it was like going to a place where effectively it was like a little city. You had the PX, which is their shops. You can get anything there. Even their food is better than. Well, I like the British ration packs, but the American ones, they had this made ready to eat stuff, which is just you can like Cajun chicken and stuff. In British stuff, you have beans. That's it, beans. The British ration pack is designed to bung you up. It's designed to make you not want to have a poo. And so it's entirely different. But yes, American ration packs are far, far better. American logistic core is far more developed than the British one. There's a lot more expectation on British infantrymen and British soldiers to be able to survive without having somebody bring them their breakfast. So this next time I went back out there, I then had my own room, and it was a lot air conditioning, and it was a lot better than the first time where you're basically in a barracks with 20 other blokes who are farting and burping and snoring and scratching and whatnot. Although I do, the abiding memory was being told about the camel spiders when we were over there. And every day you'd have to wake up and check your boots and make sure there wasn't anything lurking inside. There always was. There was always something in it, whether it be a centipede or a scorpion or something like that. But the camel spider was the big fear, because they made it out to be this thing basically the size of a dog that would eat your face if you fell asleep. It wasn't. But they're not pretty looking things, but they weren't really a problem. But I remember being terrified of a camel spider jumping on my face when I was sleeping, and it didn't happen. Forget being shot at. Camel spider was what I was most worried about.
What did a typical day look like? What were you doing at the time?
It varied. I mean, you do these things. You'd have these kind of ordnance meetings where, because you carry basically 3 kinds of ordnance weapons on the Apaches. You have the Hydras, the Hellfires, and the 30mm dual ammunition cannon on the front. You have to try and decide what on each day what somebody was going to go into, because there's no point in carrying everything if you're not going to encounter something that you need everything, because it's weight. So if you have excess weight, it's going to affect your maneuverability, it's going to affect your fuel consumption, your speed, and then there's a lot of variables. What you want to be as light as possible, to be as agile as possible, and as efficient as possible. But equally, you don't want to end up turning up somewhere where you haven't got enough ordnance to get out of it.
Makes sense.
So if you haven't, maybe something like that. I'd interview, informally. I'd be talking with the pilots, because I had my own pilot. I was a Wizzo, so my pilot was a guy called. He was a guy that was my pilot. He was allocated to. I was allocated to his aircraft. Except for combat, there was another Wizzo for the combat stuff, and Wizzo is weapons systems officer. So just in case you wonder what I'm saying there. And so I'd sit down with him and I'd say, look, how did it, if he's been in any combat situations or he'd been in any kind of sorties or anything like that, then I'd say, how did the weapons systems respond? Because obviously the weapons systems engineer is responsible for the vast majority of what you do when it comes to the deployment of your weapons. Ultimate decision is with your pilot, but you're preparing everything. You're scanning for your targets and things, because we were into targeting systems was what we were predominantly there for. The new Apaches, the longbows, the AH-64Ds, have a far more developed target. The system we worked on is called TEVS, which is a target evaluation system. It's a lot more developed now. Basically, on the top of the aircraft, you've got this kind of lump on top of the rotors, and they call it the glitter ball, the disco ball. And the purpose of it is that you should be able to just pop up that above the horizon. That can then scan the terrain around you, your battleground. It can identify targets, it can prioritize targets, and it can then suggest which weaponry to use. So that was what I was predominantly working on. I mean, the actual ordnance, the Hellfire, the Hydras, and the cannons.
So, just for common knowledge, the Hydras are non-guided rockets.
Yeah.
And the Hellfires are
if you look
air-to-ground missiles, right?
Yeah, if you look at the aircraft, the Hydras sit inside those little tubes.
Yeah.
The Hellfires are rockets that sit on there's no wings.
They're guided missiles.
Yeah, and then obviously your 30mm cannon sits at the front, and that tracks where you look.
Yeah.
And we're working on that as well. We were looking on the heads-up tracking systems as well. This is very early days. A lot of the stuff we did then it wasn't software based. This was all hardware based stuff, and it was a bit hit and miss, if I'm honest. We used to have these things on the back of the helmets which had servos on, so where you looked, it would translate your head movement. That was rubbish. So that's why we went over to the eye movement thing, where you can select by using your eyes. Again, that was a bit hit and miss. A lot of issues depending on the light levels and stuff like that. So, there were a lot of things that were kind of boring but necessary. So it wasn't a particularly exciting time, because you were talking to people about what they'd experienced, and then trying to fix the things that had gone wrong. So
Lots of troubleshooting.
yeah, it's like being a car mechanic, I guess, really, just with a slightly bigger car, slightly more expensive tyres. But there was nothing, there was nothing grippingly. I mean, I've always enjoyed engineering, but for me, it wasn't a particularly exciting time. There was no. The research and development was basically you were getting the information that when we came back to the States, we then used that information to develop stuff. But when you're there, you're predominantly fixing things. You're just trying to make what should work, rather than develop it better.
Were there lots of mechanical problems?
Yeah. Dust, sand is not a good thing to get
so
inside.
I guess
anything.
they weren't really prepared at the time for the environment.
One of the big problems we had was it wasn't for me, because I wasn't there for working on the aircraft itself, but the intakes, the dual redundancy engines on an Apache, the intakes, obviously you're dragging in a lot of air when you're flying around, and the sand was just playing havoc with the engines that were there. Real problems they had there. For us, it was basically, it was just getting into stuff, really, and you had discrepancies between day and night, because you did a lot of night flying, and it gets very, very cold in the desert at night, and very, very hot during the day. So it was demanding on the hardware. So yeah, but it was fun. I enjoyed that. I like fixing problems, and I've always enjoyed that. My degree is in applied electromechanical engineering, so for me, it's always been about the application. I'm not mathematically gifted in any way, shape, or form at all. In fact, I'm almost number blind, I'd say. I don't know if there's a number version of dyslexia, but I've probably got that.
I see. Did you have somebody at home at the time that?
What, like as a girlfriend?
Yeah, or family in general.
Well, no, this is at the time I was with the American girl, so she was at home, but home was LA.
Yeah, I
or
understand.
San Francisco for her, because the family were from San Francisco.
From what I understand, you didn't have a great relationship with your mother. I guess at the time she was.
No, well, my relationship with my mum has always been a bit odd, and the reason for that is that my grandmother was jilted at the altar. Basically, she turned up to the church to marry my mother's father, and he didn't turn up. He was an Irishman, so we later found out, because my grandmother would never tell my mother who her father was, and we only found out after my grandmother had died. And it turned out he was an Irish guy from a very wealthy family, and they didn't approve of my grandmother, and so they said to him, look, if you don't come back and marry the girl we want you to, we're going to cut you out of the inheritance. So we went back. So my grandmother was a single parent, which in the 1930s, my mum was born in 1939, was just the most shame you could possibly bring on your family. So my mother was put up for fostering. So my mother was fostered for many years, until such time as my grandmother then met somebody, married him, and then she had my mother back, I think about the age of 9, and raised her. But my grandmother was very damaged. My grandmother was very affected by the whole thing. So she was very good at manipulating the situation. Now, my father, my family's fractured relationship. I have an older brother, and my mother decided that she wanted to be a hairdresser. So she left home and she went to work on cruise ships, where she met my father, who was the Master at Arms on a cruise ship called the Southern Cross. And the Master at Arms is basically head of security kind of thing. And he told her that he was divorced with 1 child. He was actually still married with 5 children. I never really got to the bottom of the chronology of what happened and where, because my brother is 2 years older than me. So clearly my mother was with this man for a long time, because before my brother was born, my brother's older than me, before my brother was born, at one point he had left my mother to go back to his wife, and then came back, but bringing 3 sons with him, that my mother then, they lived with them for 2 years. So where his wife thought her kids were for 2 years, I have no idea. But then he left her again, then came back, got her pregnant. So that was my brother. They'd left the cruise ship by this point. And then when my mother was pregnant with me, my father left again, went back to his wife. And so my mother went to live with my grandmother. So my grandmother's sphere of influence was then quite dramatic. And so my grandmother would always pretend to my mother that I was her favourite, that my elder brother she didn't really care much for. And so my mother was working, and so we moved to Swindon. My grandmother came with us, and then my mother would go to work. She'd come home, and she would. My grandmother would give the illusion to my mother that I was her favourite, and that my mother would then try and redress the balance by lavishing a lot more attention on my brother and taking him out and looking after him, thinking that she was balancing things out. But the reality was, as soon as my mother wasn't there, my grandmother made it very, very clear that I wasn't her favourite and she didn't love me, and her favourite expression was, "You're not worth a damn light, you're not worth anything." And it was kind of, but you're young, and again, you don't know, you haven't got any point of reference, you've got nothing to compare this against, to know that this is an abusive parenting style, that this is emotional abuse and psychological abuse. Physical now and again, not very often, but when my grandmother wanted to give me a good kicking, she used to. So when it came to the age of 18 and I left, my relationship with my mother was kind of very occasional, and I've told you the story before that when I went back out to the Middle East, I phoned my mother, because this is back in the day, long before mobile phones or anything like that. We used to have these satellite phones, and you had to book a slot where you could have like 15 minutes once a week. And I booked my slot, and I phoned my mother. And when you get halfway through a conversation, you know that somebody's not really that keen on talking to you. And she said, "Look, it's not nice to hear from you," because my mum never knew where I was. My mum thought I was still in LA. She never knew I'd gone. You never told her, or? Never told her. It just kind of never came up, because I never went home. So there was never any, guess where I've been, and to be honest with you, it probably wouldn't have made any difference. You wouldn't have been interested anyway. It was nothing I did was ever good enough. My brother had never had a job. He wanted to, because my grandmother made me have piano lessons from a very young age, and so I'd always been I'd gone through the thing and been classically trained as a pianist. And when it got to me leaving school, because I was always pretty lazy in school and I didn't know what I wanted to do, in between that time I left school and getting this apprenticeship, I wanted to go and do something with music. So in the UK there's a place called Dartington, which is a town in Devon, and they have a college of the arts there. And my brother had gone there to study acting. However, my brother being my brother, he then decided to get into drugs, not hard drugs, but cannabis, stuff like that. And he dropped out because he wasn't going to class, and he dropped out. So he'd come back. My mother made it very clear there wasn't enough money for me to be able to go there because my brother had gone, and so I didn't go to. So my mum was never. She wasn't a bad mum. She just wasn't particularly interested in me. It's probably the best way of putting it. She just wasn't that keen on discussing my life. So I'd never told her where I was. And I'd phoned her this time. And as halfway through the conversation, it's quite clear that she's not really that interested in having this conversation. She said, "No, it's not lovely to hear from you, but I'm just wondering why you're phoning me up today." And I said, "Well, I thought you might like to wish me a happy birthday." To which my mum said, "Oh, that means it's your brother's birthday in 2 days. I better get him a present." And that kind of summed up the relationship. Later in life, my mum developed dementia, and she came to live near to where we were. And the first time my mother ever told me she'd loved me was after she'd been quite lengthily diagnosed with dementia. It wasn't suddenly she got diagnosed and then she told me she loved me, but after a year or so after this, when she was starting to deteriorate, that's the only time she ever told me she loved me. And my brother had gone to live in Canada many years before by this point, and he had to come back over. My mum was still living independently, but she had carers, because we'd managed to get her to accept that she had dementia and that she needed support, because Amanda and I were both working full time, obviously. And she needed medication at certain times and people to come in and cook for her. And my brother had to come back to the UK because he had to renew his visa to go back to Canada where he was living. He was married to a Canadian girl, but he had to renew his visa. So he was going to go and live with my mum for a little while, with a view possibly for her to go back to Canada to live, which I was quite happy with. However, up to that point, when my mother got dementia, she would phone me 20 or 30 times a day. I had to get to the stage where I had to get a different phone, because obviously I'm working as a cop at this time, and I had to get another phone which had an answer machine message on it saying, oh, everything's okay, Mum, I'll give you a call when I get a break from work. My brother turned up. I didn't hear from her for 6 weeks. That's how disinterested she was. My brother was back, the blue-eyed boy was back, and as far as he was concerned, that's all that mattered. And he caused chaos. He convinced that she didn't have dementia, because my brother has always got to be the smartest person in the room. You know, if the best way to describe it is, if you've been to Tenerife, he's been to 11 Tenerife. And he convinced her she didn't have dementia, which caused loads of problems because she wasn't taking the medication. And the whole thing was very fractious, and that kind of made me realise that the relationship which I thought I developed with my mother was just because of the dementia. It wasn't really anything. There was no substance to it. I think she loved me. I don't doubt for a second she did, but it wasn't. We were never particularly close. And I think it was only when she got to the end of her life where she was dependent that we had any kind of closeness. It was nice, but it wasn't
authentic.
No, it was predominantly driven by her dementia rather than by her feelings towards me. I don't blame her. She thought she was doing the right thing. She didn't realise what was going on. I did have the discussion with her about what grandmother was like, and it was quite an emotional one, because my grandmother had been like that with her as well. But it was too late by that point. I was in my 40s, late 40s, I think, by the time we had this conversation. And it was too late. You know, there was too much water under the bridge by this point. It is what it is. You know, there was no mental health support for my grandmother. I don't blame her for the person she was, as horrible as she was, because she had no understanding of her own psychology. Same with my mum. My mum didn't know that my grandmother was manipulating her. She thought she was doing the right thing. But the circumstances ended up being... It made me the person I am. It made me leave home early. It made me a lot less dependent on anybody. However, I do have to say that when I met Amanda, my wife, her family, her mother, who died a few months ago, and her family, because she's got a big family, I got nobody. It was literally my mum, my brother, and me, and my grandmother, and that was it. There was no extended family. Being part of Amanda's family is just the best thing ever. Love it to bits. Love it. Love the relationship that she has with her brother and uncles and cousins and ex-husbands and things like that. That the ex-husband is at the Christmas dinner, and you know, because he's the nephew of Roy, Mandy's previous husband is Roy, Mandy's stepfather's nephew, so that's why he's always there.
Tricky.
Is what it is, isn't it? You know, it is. I told people about this, and they went, "What? Ex-husbands at the Christmas day? Yeah, isn't that weird?" Yeah, but it is what it is. And now, you know, we've been together for 20 years now, so now it's just our normal. You know, I'd be surprised if he wasn't there now. I get on very well with him. He's all right. He's a nice enough guy, so you know.
Did these things from your childhood ever influence you in a way when
horrifically,
as you grew older?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a very strong believer that your childhood does dictate the person that you are. I mean, I suffered a lot with my mental health, certainly with my self-esteem. The imposter syndrome thing, which people talk about now, where I remember when I joined the cops, I remember on the intake, the group of people that started on the same day, sitting there was 12 of us. There were 5 guys and 7 women who joined on the same day. I remember looking round at all these people even though I was probably the oldest that was there, with most life experience, I remember looking around and thinking, they're all going to be better than me at this. And all throughout my life, I've always never really felt good enough. And there's always a little voice in the back of your head, you're not worth a damn light, you're not worth a damn light. So yeah, it does affect you. But half the battle is recognizing this and not repeating that. When I got together with Amanda, obviously she had 2 children, I didn't have children, and the sort of negativity and criticism that would raise its head through the things that my grandmother used to be like with me, I had to really focus on not repeating that with my children now. I don't want to pass that negativity onto them. I don't want to tell them they can't do. When I say can't do something, obviously, tell them they can't do something, but that they can't be what they want to be if they work hard enough. And I've always said to the kids, you can be anything as long as it's not at somebody else's cost. Don't ever make yourself feel better by making somebody else feel worse. So if you want to have something, you want to go for that, that's fine. But don't do it by kicking somebody else down to get what you want, because there's enough of that in the world. So yeah, it does. And it still does. It still presents itself. I still have this continual... I had an obsessive compulsive disorder for about 35 years. And it was really bad. It was anyone who is not having your knives and forks lined up or anything like that, it's horrific and insidious, and it affects every part of your life. And it was only when I had this massive breakdown in the early 2000s that I then managed to dig myself out, have counselling, get to the bottom of all of the poltergeists bouncing around in the haunted house of my head, to then realise that once I'd dealt with that strangely, this obsessive compulsive disorder just had gone. It was all intertwined. Everything's holistic. If you have poor mental health, it affects so much of your life. Your physical well-being, everything. Years ago we had an input in work in the cops from one of the caseworkers from Dr. Barnardo's. Now, Dr. Barnardo's is a very old British charity which was set up to look after children. And this was all about a thing called ACEs, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. They were discussing, because we deal with a lot of juveniles in the police, and it's trying to understand, to see beyond what is just stood in front of you, to see that this is somebody's behaviour is probably informed by something else. And one of the things that they said was that if you have a certain amount of adverse childhood experiences of different types, it can physically affect you, that your brain will structure differently, and it can actually lead to certain chronic diseases. The most prolific of them is type 2 diabetes, which I have, and my brother doesn't. And I've never been obese. I've never been in the risk group by my lifestyle or by my weight or by any of these things. And it was kind of an eye-opener to me that maybe the reason I've got this is because of these experiences I had when I was a child, because they said it's very prominent in people who've had these experiences for them to develop certain chronic illnesses such as type 2 diabetes. I've got the same genetic makeup. My father's the same as my brother's. My mother's the same as my brother's. He hasn't got it. Interesting. So yeah, it does affect you, and it is a struggle. And I think that anyone who's had poor mental health, it's kind of like being an alcoholic, really. I think you've got to accept the fact that you're always going to be, not fighting it, that's not the right way of putting it, but you've always got to be aware of that abyss lurking in the background. If I'm tired or if I'm stressed, I can feel these things and these anxieties. I get worried about things for no reason. I catastrophize stuff. So I have to be very mindful that there are times I've got to take myself off, have a word with myself, and try and keep this positivity going. I'm very lucky to have Amanda, because obviously, Amanda, she's not going to let me wallow in self-pity.
Yeah, whenever I just hear cases of just in general, complex childhood, to not call them any other way. It's just I always feel very grateful that I never had to go through that, and I always try to imagine how that affects someone.
I think I've been very lucky. It's affected me, but I'm still here. I've achieved, as I said, I've been lucky enough to achieve the things I've achieved, and I've got through it, and it's given me a unique perspective. Being in the cops, you deal with a lot of people that have got a lot of mental health problems. You deal with a lot of people that are a product of their upbringing. It doesn't excuse behaviour. If people act inappropriately or badly, just because they've had a bad childhood, that doesn't justify.
It just, I guess, gives it a little bit more context.
It informs it, yeah. For me, I've always had the belief that if you've had an abusive physical or whatever upbringing, you have my utmost sympathy, up to the point that you start doing that to your family. That's that point where you can break that cycle. As horrifically hard as it may be, you know it was awful. So for you to then repeat that action, then you have to accept that that's the point where you've made an informed decision, albeit informed by things that are horrible. But could you let Mabel in?
Sure.
But I think that for me is the point where my sympathy does wane somewhat, because if you've had something which has been upsetting to you and has made you feel terrible, the moment you do that to somebody else, you've got to understand, you know what that's going to do to them. Why put them through what has damaged you so badly? I just don't get it. For me, that's that point where I lose a lot of my sympathy for people, because they have a lot up to that point, but we all have to choose our own path from time to time. And I can't complain about my life. I'm very, very lucky. I look back on things now, and would I have liked it to be different? Yeah, of course I would. Come on, missus. But would I be the person I am today if it hadn't happened? And likelihood is no. It's like when I met Amanda when I was 40, and I've always said I'd love to have met you earlier, and she's, you wouldn't have been the same person. We probably wouldn't still be together if we'd met when we were in our 20s. And she's probably right. We are the product of what we are. And sometimes you have to embrace that as being the person that you are, good and bad. Nobody's totally bad. Nobody's totally good. And if you are happy with certain aspects of your life, you've got to realise that maybe the things that you're not happy with are as informed as the good things that you're with. So it's a matter of balancing those things out. But, this is where I am.
Yeah, I just I thought it would be very useful to have a little bit of context on that part of your life.
Yeah, I've been in, as you know, been in combat situations and been in lots of things with the cops. I've never had PTSD, which is a weird thing. That to me is just not generally part of my psychology. It's an odd thing, and it's not a strength. It's just that isn't a button that gets pressed with me. I've dealt with lots and lots and lots and lots of traumatic death, and 99.9% of the time, I'm very capable of being dispassionately removed from it. I'm not saying I don't care about it, but I have that professional detachment from it that allows me to be able to deal with what's in front of me without being horrified or upset or traumatized. Every now and again, one gets through the armor, and Amanda was instrumental in putting things in place, trauma resilience management in the police, to allow you to be able to go and speak to somebody. They would discuss these things with you. They'd give you a little score. They didn't tell you what the score was. And then you'd have another follow-up meeting a couple of weeks later.
The cat's...
Mabel, what are you doing? Hey, get off that. It's cheese. Terrible animal. It's alright, it's not for us. It's not our cheese. So yes, but then they'd have a follow-up thing to see whether you're improving or whether you need to go for counselling. And I've been for counselling a few times in my life. I've got no shame in talking about my mental health. I've got no shame in telling people I've been for counselling. I view mental health as something which needs to be looked at in exactly the same way as physical health. I worked in departments where you had a lot of dickheads who were in the department, you know, all macho, chest puffing. Oh, you know, somebody's crying when they sort of. That's not what it's about. You know, like I said, there's nothing. The fact that I haven't had PTSD is not because I'm strong. It's because that hasn't affected me. It's not.
It's one of those things that just doesn't really
apply
to you in general.
Just isn't my button. Animal cruelty, yeah, that's my button. That bothers me a lot. But you know, I had the argument with somebody because working for a Welsh force, they're all ex-rugby players, and I said, so if you go into a scrum and you lock in the scrum and you break your collarbone, is it because you're weak? You said, well, no, of course not. I said, it could just be the way that you look. I said, yeah, exactly. And it's exactly the same with mental health. You go to something that day, you're just not feeling great. It's just the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you then have a reaction to it. And that's all that mental health, PTSD and things. It's an adverse reaction. You can walk into an environment where everyone's coughing and spluttering, and you don't catch the cold, but your colleague does. You know, you don't get the virus, they get the virus. Exactly the same thing. It's just the luck of the draw on the day, and your reaction to it is what it is. And there's no weakness in having an issue with your mental health. The only time it becomes a weakness is when you let it define you.
And it starts affecting other people too. Yeah.
I always think with people who have mental health issues, there's two kinds of people who suffer with mental health issues, in my experience. There's the people who don't want to feel that way, and they will try so hard to improve. Sometimes they'll be a little bit more successful than others, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes they're not going to succeed, but they keep trying. They keep trying to get better. And then there are other people who almost wear it like a badge of honor, as if it's an excuse for everything that they do. Yeah. And it's not. If having poor mental health doesn't make you a dick, being a dick makes you a dick. Yeah. And you can't say, oh, you can't complain because I've got problems with mental health. Well, so is that person, but they're not being an asshole. You are. That's your personality. It's not your condition.
Yeah, that's true. I have the same views on it. I guess it's not so prominent with me, but I also see it in some other people. Where I used to see it, when they would have like the slightest problem, they would just start victimizing themselves and making it everybody else's problem. And
you mean when they're a victim? When they play a victim, but they're actually being a dick? Yeah. And you do get that. It's almost like this is an excuse for it's not an excuse for you. If you, again, it's this cycle, isn't it? If I spoke to you like that, you wouldn't be happy. So why do you think you can speak to me like that?
Yeah, it's just...
You don't know what I'm going through. You're telling me that you can behave in this appalling way because you have poor mental health. I'm not talking about something like Tourette's. I'm talking about just generally being an arsehole because you've had a bad day and something's affected you and you've got poor mental health. You don't know who the person you're speaking to is. That person you're speaking to may also have poor mental health, but they are trying very, very hard to be a lot politer and a lot more polite and accommodating and decent than you're being. And you do see that a lot with people. And I think, unfortunately, we enable people in society at the moment in time to think that anything which which relates to them suddenly becomes the most important thing in the world. And I don't think it does. I think we all need to learn to get along with each other, and that includes you showing the kind of consideration for somebody else that you expect to be shown yourself. If you can't do that, if you can't respect, it comes down to, again, with all of the things at the moment in time, is that somebody wants to refer to themselves in a certain way. That's perfectly fine. But if you encounter somebody that has a legitimate reason why they don't necessarily agree with you, if you can't allow them to have their own views, how dare you expect them to respect your views? It's not that one view is legally enshrined more than another. You've got to, if you want people to respect you and to allow you to be yourself, if you deny that to somebody else, if it isn't actually impacting upon you. I'm not talking about if you go in as an employer who doesn't want to give you a job because you're gay. I'm talking about you may meet somebody who, because of their honestly held religious belief, doesn't agree with it. Fine. Walk different paths. If you haven't got to deal with each other, and as that person's doing something which negatively impacts upon you, their opinion of you doesn't matter. Because you seem to think that your opinion of them is okay. You can think anything you want, you can say anything you want, but their opinion of you has to be challenged. We live in a world where people don't understand that the rights that you demand are the rights you must also give. And until we learn that reciprocal respect for each other, this is probably why we're in such a difficult position at the moment, where people are so angry and polarized with everything, because nobody can respect anybody else. Everyone demands that everybody listens to what they've got to say.
That's to me, it feels like it's a very tyrannical and authoritarian way to behave, and
but it's
really worrying for me, at least.
It's being amplified at the moment. I mean, social media, even the media, even the news at the moment in time. BBC was always something which I felt that I could rely on to be balanced and unbiased and even. And in the last, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years, I look at it now and it's just as salacious as any gutter press now. It's a little bit more reliable, only in as much as it does tend to give that. But the skew that they put on things is no better than the rags, the newspapers we call rags. I think that you look at America at the moment, this Democrat and Republican thing. My views, I've always, being a cop and just kind of being the person I am, I've always kind of gone pretty much middle diddle. I agree with a lot of the things that the left side of politics champion, people's rights and societal need. And I also like some of the things from the right side of things, such as maintaining standards and being able to show that there are structures in place that need to be adhered to, rather than a free for all. But for me, I don't want to be told I've got to nail my colours to the mast of one or the other. I am what I am. I'm not right wing. I'm not left wing. I'm a little bit of both, and I'm something else sprinkled in between. But it's almost like there's a demand on you to have to pledge your allegiance to the flag. I don't want to. If I don't agree with it. You see these people who are given such a voice. Charlie Kirk was a good example. Some of the things he said, I agreed with, and a lot of the things he said, I didn't agree with. But just because I didn't agree with some of the things he said, should never be that I can't agree with some of the things he did. But that's what people are expected to think. If you're either 100% for somebody or you're 100% against somebody. There can't be any. I like that element of what you're saying, but I really don't like that element of what you're saying. And I think that we're in a society at the moment where that is becoming increasingly dangerous, especially in America at the moment. That really does worry me, the way things are at the moment.
Polarization is a problem.
Yeah,
it is a problem.
And it's that also. What comes with it is that inherent self-belief that you're right. There's no opportunity for, because if I debate with somebody, if I don't agree with somebody and I discuss something with them, I'm quite happy to have my mind changed, because that then to me would show, well, you're open enough to listen. I'll argue my case if I don't agree, but if somebody says blah 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 and you go, good point.
He might be right.
Good point.
He might be right.
Yeah, and if you're not open to that, you're closed. And if you're closed, You don't learn. It's if anyone who thinks that they've reached the pinnacle of their learning in anything is just an idiot.
And it's a good sign when you realize that you might be wrong and you can learn, because it just means you're on the right track. It's that you're not gonna,
because there's no point in having
yourself. And
you see these things on TV now where you just get two people in a room who are so completely entrenched in their views, and they shout at each other. What's the point in this? What's the point in this? All I'm watching here is effectively two people who have just got blinkers on shouting at each other. This isn't a debate. This isn't even an argument. This is just a platform for one person spitting some kind of polarized bile against somebody else who's going to spit another bit of polarized bile backwards. I just think that we, in society at the moment, we just need to learn how to get on with each other instead of thinking. I've never known in my lifetime things becoming so divisive. I grew up in London. My mum was a hairdresser, and at that time she was working in London. And so the people who were in and out of my house were black, gay, Jewish, Asian. That was the norm for me. That when you're brought up around those things, it doesn't become unusual. And now there's been so many people who are just telling people, "Ooh, you live in a racist society." Yeah, but you're kind of a guy of colour on a TV, national, being given prime time to air this view. If you lived in a country that was that racist, you wouldn't be on the telly, fella. All you're doing is telling people they don't have to try. It should be about, there are inequalities, of course there are. Are there racist? Of course there are. But not to the extent that you ever want to tell people, you may as well not bother. There's no point you trying. There's no point you making good decisions. There's no point you working hard at school. There's no point in you working hard, because you live in a society which is just going to keep you down. You know where that's going to end up, and it is. Telling people that, because Morgan Freeman, somebody said to him once, "How do we stop racism?" He said, "Stop talking about it. Let's look at the things which are that bind us." My next door but one neighbour, when I lived in Swindon, when I bought my first house, was Pearl. She was one of the Windrush generation, so she came to the UK from the Caribbean in the 60s, when they were bringing people into sort of 50s and 60s, when they were bringing people in to supplement the workforce. And she was great. I mean, she was a fantastic cook. Her husband and her sons worked in the post office supplies department, which was where my mum worked in, which was across the road from where we were living. And I had to sneak in most days because she was trying to drag me in and feed me because I was living on my own. But we would talk about, what it was like when you grew up. We spoke about our cultural differences because we were sitting at the same table. This is our cultural convergence. I was interested in what their country was like when they grew up, the differences. I was fascinated by it. Now you're not allowed to ask, because if you do, it's considered disrespectful. I thought it was very respectful. She was respectful. We cared deeply about each other. Okay, she had a completely different cultural background to me. I wanted to learn about it. The food that she cooked, I'd never tasted that stuff before. Loved it. But this is what we should be doing. We should be celebrating. There'll always be times we don't get on with people, but then let's just say we'll agree to disagree. We've lost the ability as a society to say we'll agree to disagree. I respect your opinion, you respect mine. Let's move on. Let's find things that we can agree on. But now it's like, oh no, you've got to hate that man. You've got to hate that guy who's different colour from you. You've got to hate that guy. In the UK, reform, all of these people, is telling people that they can't be friends with people because of their cultural differences. The Romanians. You were held up as the pinnacle of the thing we should fear most and why we should come out of Europe. And it's just nonsense. But I remember they did this TV programme just before Brexit called The Romanians Are Coming. And they filmed it. They must have gone out of their way to find the most deprived Roma gypsy village in all of Romania, trying to pretend this is basically Bucharest. This is what it's like over there. And it's just like nonsense.
Yeah.
Let's stop looking at things to fear and hate each other with. Let's try and find things we can get on with each other. Because we've lived over here, and there are things about Romania which it just don't work for me. But I don't have to. It doesn't have to define things. It is what it is.
Yep.
I'm not so keen on Mama Liga, as you know. Ah.
All right.
There we are.
So
So
we'll stop it here.
okay.